The morning of March 6, 1944, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, inside Hangar 4 of the Army Air Force's Materiel Command, a test stood ready that would rewrite the mathematics of aerial warfare. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen watched as ground crews rolled 55-gallon drums toward a solitary P-51 Mustang, its silver skin reflecting the harsh overhead lights. The drums bore no standard military markings. Instead, hand-stenciled letters read simply, "Test fuel, handle with extreme caution." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Chen had been a flight test engineer for 18 months. He had seen experimental propellers shatter at 4,000 revolutions per minute. He had watched prototype engines seize and smoke, but he had never seen fuel treated like unstable explosives. The liquid inside those drums was designated 100/150 grade aviation gasoline. The first number represented its octane rating under lean mixture conditions. The second number, 150, represented its performance under the rich, high-power settings used for takeoff and combat. That second number was theoretically impossible. The octane scale topped out at 100, representing pure iso-octane. Anything beyond required a new measurement system called performance number. This fuel didn't just exceed the scale, it shattered it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The fuel had arrived under armed guard 3 days earlier, not because of its monetary value, though at an estimated development cost exceeding $2 million, it represented one of the most expensive liquids ever created. The guards were there because this fuel contained secrets that could not fall into enemy hands. Specific chemical composition, the exact additive formulations, the precise refining processes that made it possible. Captain James Holland, the test pilot assigned to the mission, stood beside the aircraft with his flight checklist. He was 26 years old, a veteran of 32 combat missions over North Africa before being rotated stateside for test duty. He understood what combat over Germany demanded. He had watched bomber formations limp home with engines trailing smoke and wings shredded by cannon fire. He had attended too many memorial services for crews who never returned. "Walk me through this again," Holland said to the civilian engineer beside him, a thin man in spectacles named Dr. Arthur Whitmore. Whitmore carried a leather-bound notebook filled with calculations. Standard 100/130 fuel allows your Packard Merlin to generate approximately 1,750 horsepower at military power settings. That's 61 inches of manifold pressure. With this fuel, we can push to 75 inches. We estimate peak output approaching 2,000 horsepower, perhaps slightly more. And the engine won't detonate? The additives prevent premature detonation, primarily xylidine, along with carefully balanced proportions of tetraethyl lead. The xylidine is particularly effective at suppressing knock under high manifold pressure, but it's highly toxic. Ground crews have strict handling protocols. Holland studied the drums being hand-pumped into the Mustang's fuel system. Internal tanks first, then the two 108-gallon drop tanks mounted under the wings. Total fuel load, 485 gallons. "What's the catch?" Holland asked. "There's always a catch." Whitmore permitted himself a thin smile. "The fuel is corrosive to synthetic rubber components. Seals, gaskets, fuel lines, anything rubber will degrade faster. We estimate spark plug life drops from 50 hours to perhaps 12. Unstable in storage, breaking down chemically after several weeks, and it's viciously toxic. Inhalation of vapors causes nausea and neurological symptoms. Skin contact requires immediate washing." Sounds delightful. It's also the only way to win the air war over Germany. The statement hung in the cold Ohio air. Holland understood the implications immediately. The strategic bombing campaign was hemorrhaging aircraft and crews at unsustainable rates. Deep penetration raids to Berlin, 580 miles from English bases, required fighter escort throughout the mission. The standard P-51, while possessing good range, operated at the edge of its endurance on Berlin missions. Pilots returned with fuel gauges reading empty, occasionally making emergency landings on the French coast when headwinds or combat maneuvering consumed the final reserves. Extra power meant extra speed. Extra speed meant reaching targets faster, spending less time in German airspace, reducing exposure to flak and fighters. Extra power also meant superior climb rate and acceleration in combat. The difference between shooting down an enemy fighter and becoming a smoking crater. "When do we fly?" Holland asked. 30 minutes. Weather is clear to 20,000 feet. We'll conduct speed runs at various altitudes, then high-power climbs to evaluate performance. The test protocol had been carefully designed over weeks of planning. First, baseline measurements using standard 100/130 fuel. Then, after landing and refueling with the experimental blend, identical runs for direct comparison. Every instrument reading would be recorded. Airspeed, altitude, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, exhaust gas temperature, fuel flow. The data would determine whether this expensive, dangerous fuel justified operational use. Holland completed his pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency. Control surfaces moved freely. Tires showed proper inflation. Oil levels read full. The Packard Merlin engine, a license-built copy of the British Rolls-Royce design, sat silent behind its precisely cowled panels. 12 cylinders arranged in a V configuration, two-stage, two-speed supercharger for maintaining power at altitude. Liquid cooling system using a mixture of water and ethylene glycol. The engine represented the pinnacle of piston-powered aviation technology. Yet even this magnificent power plant operated with fundamental limitations imposed by the fuel feeding it. Inside the engine's cylinders, the fuel-air mixture compressed before ignition. Higher compression ratios yielded more power, but compression also generated heat. Too much heat caused the fuel to detonate prematurely. Not a controlled burn spreading from the spark plug, but a supersonic shockwave that could punch holes through pistons and destroy the engine within seconds. Octane rating measured fuel's resistance to this destructive detonation. The higher the octane, the more compression and boost pressure the engine could tolerate. This relationship between fuel quality and engine output was not theoretical. It was brutally practical, measured in horsepower and manifold pressure readings that translated directly into aircraft performance. The United States had begun the war with 87-octane aviation fuel as its standard. By 1940, American refineries were producing 100-octane in quantity, primarily using a catalytic cracking process developed by a French émigré named Eugene Houdry. The Houdry process transformed crude oil into high-octane components with remarkable efficiency. But 100-octane, while a tremendous advance, proved insufficient for the demands of strategic air warfare. The British, fighting for survival during the Battle of Britain, had switched their fighter aircraft to 100-octane fuel in the summer of 1940. The results were immediate and dramatic. Spitfires and Hurricanes, that had been marginally outperformed by German Messerschmitts, suddenly gained 30 miles per hour in top speed and 1,000 feet per minute in climb rate. The fuel didn't modify the aircraft. It simply allowed their engines to develop the power the designers had intended. By 1943, 100/130 had become the Allied standard. The 100 represented lean mixture performance used for economical cruise flight. The 130 represented rich mixture performance used for takeoff and combat when maximum power mattered more than fuel economy. The rich mixture provided charge cooling. The extra fuel absorbed heat through evaporation, allowing higher manifold pressures without detonation. But even 100/130 had limitations. German fighters still held performance advantages at certain altitudes. American bombers still bled losses at rates approaching 5% per mission on deep penetration raids. The 8th Air Force, flying from England, had lost 600 aircraft and 6,000 aircrewmen during the single month of October 1943. Something had to change. The answer emerged not from aircraft designers or engine manufacturers, but from petroleum chemists working in laboratories far from the combat zones. The development of 100/150 fuel represented a convergence of multiple research programs pursuing higher octane through different approaches. Shell Oil, working with British researchers, investigated aromatics benzene-based compounds with excellent anti-knock properties. Standard Oil explored alkylation processes that created branched hydrocarbon chains resistant to detonation. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company tested various additive combinations. The breakthrough came with silidine, a nitrogen-containing aromatic compound derived from coal tar. When added to carefully formulated base stocks in precise proportions, silidine raised the rich mixture, performance number to 150. But silidine presented serious challenges. It was toxic, corrosive, and difficult to produce in quantity. The fuel containing it degraded during storage, breaking down into compounds that could actually reduce octane rather than increase it. These problems demanded solutions before operational use became possible. The fuel required special handling procedures. Ground crews needed protective equipment and training. Aircraft fuel systems required more frequent inspection and component replacement. The fuel itself needed to be manufactured fresh and used within weeks rather than months. By January 1944, experimental batches of 100/150 were reaching American test facilities. The Army Air Force's Materiel Command initiated trials to determine whether the performance gains justified the operational complications. Captain Holland strapped into the P-51's cockpit and began the engine start sequence. Battery switch on, fuel shut-off valve open, mixture control to idle cut-off, throttle cracked 1 inch, clear prop, energize. The Merlin coughed once, then caught with a deep rumble that built to a steady roar. He ran through the instrument checks systematically, oil pressure rising to normal range, coolant temperature climbing steadily. Magneto checks showed even firing on both systems, generator output positive, all readings nominal. Tower clearance came through the radio. Holland advanced the throttle, and the Mustang rolled toward the active runway. The morning air was cold and dense, ideal conditions for maximum engine performance. At the runway threshold, he pushed the throttle fully forward. The Merlin howled and the acceleration pressed him back into the seat. 60 miles per hour, 80. The tail lifted as forward speed increased. 100 miles per hour, and the Mustang broke ground, climbing strongly into the Ohio sky. The test card called for speed runs at 5,000 foot, intervals from sea level to 30,000 feet. At each altitude, Holland would note maximum true airspeed, then perform a timed climb to evaluate rate of ascent. The baseline data using standard fuel would establish the comparison metrics. At 10,000 feet, leveling off and accelerating to maximum continuous power, the Mustang indicated 342 miles per hour true airspeed. Holland recorded the number on his kneeboard, along with manifold pressure 61 inches and engine RPM at 3,000. Cylinder head temperatures read nominal. The Merlin ran smoothly, the characteristic whine of the two-stage supercharger barely audible over the slipstream noise. He continued climbing, 20,000 feet, 25,000. At 30,000 feet, the air was thin and bitterly cold. Maximum speed read 408 miles per hour true. The supercharger laboured to compress the rarefied atmosphere into pressures the engine could use. After 90 minutes aloft, Holland descended and landed. Ground crews immediately began draining the remaining 100/130 fuel and filling the tanks with the experimental blend. Dr. Whitmore approached as Holland shut down the engine. How did she handle? Textbook perfect. No surprises. Good. We're fueling with the 150 grade now. Same test profile. Push her as hard as the fuel allows. Holland watched the refueling operation. The ground crews wore heavy rubber gloves and respirators. The fuel itself appeared identical to standard aviation gasoline, clear with a slightly amber tint, but the precautions told the real story. This was dangerous material, 30 minutes later, Holland lifted off again. With the throttle pushed through the wire gate to war emergency power, the manifold pressure gauge climbed past 61 inches, 65, 70, 75. The acceleration was violent, pressing him hard into the rave. Seat back. The Mustang clawed toward altitude with a climb rate exceeding 4,000 feet per minute. At 10,000 feet, maximum speed measured 367 miles per hour, 25 miles per hour faster than the baseline run. At 20,000 feet, the advantage grew to 30 miles per hour. At 30,000 feet, the Mustang reached 439 miles per hour, a full 31 miles per hour faster than with standard fuel. The difference was transformative. Every performance metric improved substantially. Climb rate increased by more than 400 feet per minute. Time to altitude decreased by 3 minutes to reach 25,000 feet. The engine ran hotter, cylinder head temperatures approached the red line but stayed within operational limits. After landing, Holland climbed from the cockpit with a grin that told Dr. Whitmore everything before any words were exchanged. "Well?" Whitmore asked. "This fuel is going to change everything." The test data confirmed Holland's assessment. The performance gains exceeded even optimistic predictions, but numbers on paper meant nothing without operational validation. The fuel needed to prove itself under combat conditions in the hands of frontline fighter pilots facing German interceptors over the heart of the Third Reich. The decision to proceed with operational trials fell to General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force in England. Doolittle was uniquely qualified to evaluate the fuel question. Before the war, while working for Shell Oil, he had been instrumental in developing and advocating for 100-octane fuel. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He understood both the science of combustion and the realities of combat aviation. In February 1944, Doolittle received the test reports from Wright Field. He also received intelligence assessments of German fighter capabilities. The Luftwaffe was introducing new T aircraft types. The Focke-Wulf 190 Dora, with its powerful radial engine, improved versions of the Messerschmitt 109, with water methanol injection for emergency power. American fighters needed every advantage available. Doolittle authorized operational trials. Selected fighter groups would receive supplies of 100/150 fuel. The groups chosen were those flying the longest-range escort missions, primarily P-51 Mustang units, tasked with escorting bombers to targets deep in Germany. The fuel arrived in England during March 1944, transported in specially marked drums aboard cargo ships that crossed the Atlantic in heavily escorted convoys. The drums were painted purple, a distinctive colour that prevented confusion with standard fuel stocks. Ground crews quickly began calling it Purple Passion, due to both its colour and its reputation for delivering dramatic performance. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer commanded the 352nd Fighter Group, based at Bodney in East Anglia. His group was among the first selected for the new fuel. Meyer gathered his pilots in the operations building on March 15th to brief them on the change. "Gentlemen, we're switching to experimental high-octane fuel starting tomorrow, designated 150 grade. What you need to know: first, it gives us roughly 250 extra horsepower. That translates to about 30 miles per hour more speed and significantly better climb. Second, it's toxic and corrosive. Don't get it on your skin. Don't breathe the fumes. Let the ground crews handle fueling. Third, it fouls plugs faster. If your engine starts running rough, run it at high power for 2 or 3 minutes to burn off deposits. Fourth, and most important, this fuel puts us on equal footing or better with anything the Luftwaffe flies. Use that advantage." The pilots absorbed the information with the practiced nonchalance of men who flew into flak and fighter, opposition daily. Faster speed and better climb meant higher survival probability. The operational details about toxicity and maintenance were ground crew problems. 2 days later, Meyer led his group on an escort mission to Berlin. 50 P-51s, each loaded with 485 gallons of fuel, the purple-painted 150 grade, now filling their tanks, lifted off from Bodny at 0800 hours. The mission profile called for rendezvous with bomber formations over the Dutch coast, then escort to the target and back. Total flight time would exceed 6 hours. Range to Berlin and return measured 1,100 miles, accounting for the dogleg route around known flak concentrations. At 25,000 feet over northern Germany, the formation encountered Luftwaffe interceptors, Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, perhaps 30 aircraft, diving from altitude in the classic bounce tactics German fighters employed. Meyer pushed his throttle through the gate to war emergency power. The manifold pressure jumped to 75 inches. The Mustang surged forward with authority that felt fundamentally different from anything he had experienced in hundreds of hours flying fighters. A Messerschmitt lined up ahead of him, preparing to make a firing pass on a B-17. Meyer closed the distance faster than the German pilot expected. At 300 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns converged their fire. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in a spray of metal fragments. Across the formation, similar encounters played out. The extra speed let American pilots control engagement geometry, choosing when to fight and when to disengage. The superior climb rate allowed them to recover altitude quickly after combat, maintaining position with the bombers they escorted. The mission returned to Bodny 6 hours and 40 minutes after takeoff. 50 aircraft departed, 48 returned. One pilot had been shot down by flak near Berlin, but parachuted safely and became a prisoner of war. Another made an emergency landing in Belgium after battle damage severed fuel lines. Compared to the catastrophic loss rates of late 1943, when 10% losses were common, the results represented tremendous progress. More significantly, the group claimed 13 German fighters destroyed, with an additional 7 probably destroyed or damaged. The kill ratio, the number of enemy aircraft destroyed versus friendly losses, exceeded 6 to 1. These were sustainable numbers. The Luftwaffe could not replace experienced pilots at such rates. The Allies could. Over subsequent weeks, more fighter groups transitioned to 150-grade fuel. By May 1944, most 8th Air Force fighter units operated exclusively on the new fuel when available. Supply remained limited. American refineries could not yet produce it in the quantities needed for all operations. Priority went to fighter units conducting the deepest penetration missions. The impact on the air war was measurable in hard statistics. In January 1944, before widespread adoption of the new fuel, 8th Air Force fighters claimed 263 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. By May, with most fighter groups using 150 grade, the total reached 449 destroyed. Loss rates among bomber formations dropped from approximately 5% to less than 2% for escorted missions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The realization came gradually for Luftwaffe pilots, then all at once. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, flying with Jagdgeschwader 27 from an airfield near Munich, noticed it first during a mission over Frankfurt in late April 1944. His Messerschmitt 109 G6 had engaged a Feings, a formation of Mustangs escorting B-17s. The encounter followed familiar patterns initially. The Americans held altitude advantage. The Germans tried to break through to reach the bombers. But something was different. The Mustangs accelerated faster than Stiegler had seen in previous engagements. When he attempted his standard tactic of diving away to disengage, building speed to escape, the American fighters stayed with him. One particular Mustang closed the gap, despite Stiegler's Messerschmitt reaching 450 miles per hour in the dive. Stiegler managed to escape by flying into a cloud bank, a maneuver he considered beneath the dignity of a fighter pilot with 47 victories. Back at base, during the mission debrief, he reported the incident to his squadron commander, Major Gustav Rodel. "The Americans have changed something," Stiegler said. "Their aircraft perform differently, faster acceleration, better climb. They held speed in the dive that should not be possible for a Mustang." Rodel listened carefully. He had flown combat since 1940 and trusted Stiegler's assessment. You're not the first to mention this. Hauptmann Werner received similar reports from pilots in JG-26 yesterday. Intelligence believes the Americans may be using a new fuel formulation. Can we obtain samples for analysis? Already in progress. A Mustang made a forced landing near Schweinfurt 3 days ago. The pilot set fire to the aircraft, but some fuel remained in the lines. Chemical analysis is underway. The analysis, conducted at a Luftwaffe technical facility near Berlin, revealed the truth. The captured fuel samples showed octane ratings far exceeding standard Allied aviation gasoline. German chemists identified the presence of xylidine and other aromatic compounds in concentrations that their own fuel specifications did not match. The report reached Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, in early May. Göring convened a meeting with senior technical staff and operational commanders to discuss the implications. Major General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, and one of Germany's most successful fighter aces, with over 100 victories, presented the tactical assessment. Galland was 42 years old, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War and every major air campaign since. He spoke with the authority of extensive combat experience. The Americans have solved their remaining performance deficiencies, Galland stated. The Mustang was already a capable aircraft. With this fuel, it surpasses our fighters in most performance categories above 6,000 meters. They are faster, climb better, and can maintain combat power for extended periods. What about our own fuel development? Göring asked. Can we match their capabilities? The technical officer, Oberst Wilhelm H.N.L., responded with careful precision. Our chemists understand the chemistry involved. We could theoretically produce similar fuels. However, we face fundamental constraints. First, xylidine production requires coal tar derivatives. Our coal-to-liquid fuel plants already operate at maximum capacity producing basic aviation fuel. Diverting resources to xylidine production would reduce overall fuel availability. Second, the additive makes the fuel unstable and corrosive. Our logistics system is not designed to handle fuels that degrade during storage and damage rubber components. Third, and most critically, we lack sufficient base stock. High-octane fuel requires light hydrocarbon fractions from petroleum refining. Our Romanian oil supplies, while substantial, are not sufficient for both current fuel production and an upgrade to higher octane grades. The mathematics were brutal. Germany produced approximately 150,000 tons of aviation fuel per month from all sources: Romanian crude oil, synthetic fuel from coal, and small amounts from domestic oil fields. This barely met operational requirements. The Luftwaffe alone consumed approximately 130,000 tons monthly. The remainder went to training and reserves. By comparison, American refineries produced over 300,000 tons of aviation fuel per month, with capacity still expanding. The United States could afford to invest resources in exotic fuel formulations. Germany could not. So we continue with our current fuel and accept the performance disadvantage? Göring asked, his voice sharp with frustration. We have made improvements, H.N.L. replied. Our C-tree fuel now achieves approximately 115 octane equivalent through careful refining and additives. This is superior to what we had in 1942, but it does not match the reported American 150 grade. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Galland interjected. The fuel is only part of our problem. The Americans also have numerical superiority. In March, we faced approximately 450 American fighters during deep penetration raids. By May, that number exceeded 700. We cannot replace our pilot losses at current attrition rates. In April, we lost 312 single-engine fighters on the Western Front. Replacement pilots arrive with perhaps 150 hours total flight time. American pilots have 400 hours before their first combat mission. The meeting continued for 3 hours, covering tactics, defensive strategies, and resource allocation, but the fundamental conclusion remained unchanged. The Luftwaffe was fighting a losing battle of attrition against an enemy with superior resources, superior training pipelines, and now superior fuel. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Feldwebel Heinz Knoke, who kept a detailed diary throughout the war, wrote on May 17, 1944, "The enemy fighters now possess capabilities that make successful interception nearly impossible. Their speed advantage allows them to control every engagement. We can no longer rely on diving away to safety. Today we lost 5 aircraft from our Staffel, 3 pilots killed, 2 wounded. The replacements who arrived yesterday have barely 40 hours in the 109. How long can this continue?" The answer, though Knoke did not yet know it, was less than a year. But the fuel disparity represented only one factor in a larger industrial imbalance that would ultimately prove decisive. Back in England, the operational impact of 150-grade fuel extended beyond simple performance numbers. The fuel enabled tactical changes that multiplied its effectiveness. Prior to its introduction, P-51 units flying Escort to Berlin operated at the edge of their endurance. Pilots flew conservative cruise profiles to maximize range. Combat over the target consumed precious fuel. The extra power from 150-grade fuel allowed higher cruise speeds without excessive fuel consumption. The Merlin engine, operating at higher efficiency due to better combustion characteristics, could maintain 280 miles per hour cruise instead of 260. This seemingly small difference saved 15 minutes on the Berlin mission, 15 minutes less exposure to flak and fighters, 15 minutes more fuel margin for combat maneuvering. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group exploited these capabilities to become one of the war's top-scoring aces. On April 8, 1944, leading a flight of 4 Mustangs on an escort mission to Brunswick, Gentile used the fuel's performance advantage to devastating effect. At 28,000 feet, his flight encountered approximately 20 Messerschmitt 109s attempting to intercept the bomber formation. Gentile pushed to war emergency power and climbed above the German fighters, gaining altitude advantage. When the Messerschmitts committed to their attack, Gentile rolled into a diving turn that brought him onto the tail of the lead German aircraft. The Messerschmitt pilot, realizing his danger, attempted to dive away. But Gentile's Mustang, powered by 150-grade fuel, accelerated faster in the dive. At 400 yards, Gentile fired a 2-second burst. The Messerschmitt exploded. Gentile pulled up hard, the extra power allowing him to regain altitude quickly. Within 3 minutes, he had positioned for another attack. 2 more Messerschmitts fell to his guns before the German formation scattered. Gentile's mission report noted the critical role of the fuel. Aircraft performance with new fuel exceeds any previous capability. Able to control all aspects of engagement. Strongly recommend continued priority allocation. By June 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion, the air superiority enabled by factors including the new fuel had become absolute. Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, depended on complete control of the skies over the landing beaches. German aircraft were virtually absent from the invasion area. The Luftwaffe had been systematically destroyed through months of attrition it could not sustain. The production of 150-grade fuel represented a massive industrial undertaking. By mid-1944, 17 Allied refineries across the United States and Britain were producing the fuel. The largest facility was Standard Oil's Baton Rouge refinery in Louisiana, which dedicated an entire processing unit to high-octane production. The manufacturing process required multiple steps. Base stock came from catalytic cracking units that broke down heavy crude oil fractions into lighter, more volatile compounds. These base stocks then underwent alkylation, a chemical process that rearranged hydrocarbon molecular structures to create branched chains resistant to detonation. Isomerization, converted straight-chain molecules into branched isomers with superior octane characteristics. The final blending stage added precise quantities of tetraethyl lead for basic octane boosting, then xylidine for the crucial performance number increase to 150. Quality control testing occurred at every stage. Samples underwent laboratory analysis using standardized test engines that measured detonation characteristics under controlled conditions. The production volume steadily increased throughout 1944. In March, Allied refineries produced approximately 3,000 tons of 150-grade fuel. By June, output reached 12,000 tons monthly. By September, production exceeded 20,000 tons per month. This still represented only a fraction of total aviation fuel production, but it was enough to supply frontline fighter units conducting the most critical missions. The fuel's instability presented logistical challenges. Standard military fuel could be stored for months without degradation. 150 grade began breaking down within 6 weeks of production, its carefully balanced chemistry shifting as compounds reacted with themselves and with container materials. This meant the fuel needed to be used relatively soon after manufacture. The solution involved a continuous supply pipeline. Refineries shipped fresh fuel to forward depots in regular batches. The depots distributed it to operational bases within days. At the bases, ground crews fueled aircraft from drums marked with production dates. Any fuel older than 5 weeks went to non-combat uses or was blended into standard fuel stocks. The handling procedures required careful training. Technical Sergeant Robert Walsh, crew chief for a P-51 at Debden, received 3 days of instruction on the new fuel before his unit transitioned to it. They emphasized the toxicity repeatedly, Walsh recalled in post-war interviews. We wore rubber gloves and respirators when handling the fuel. One guy on another crew got fuel on his forearm through a torn glove. Within minutes, his skin turned red and started blistering. They sent him to the aid station and he was off duty for 2 weeks. We took it seriously after that. The corrosive effects on rubber components proved manageable, but required increased maintenance. Fuel system inspections occurred after every 50 hours of operation instead of the standard 100 hours. Rubber seals and gaskets were replaced preventively. Most critically, spark plugs needed changing every 12 to 15 flight hours. This maintenance burden increased ground crew workload substantially. A typical P-51 required approximately 20 man-hours of maintenance per flight hour under normal operations. With 150-grade fuel, this increased to approximately 25 man-hours per flight hour. Fighter groups needed larger ground crew complements to maintain operational readiness, but the performance advantages justified the extra effort. Pilot survival rates improved, mission success rates increased. The air war began shifting decisively in favor of the Allies. The German response, constrained by limited resources, focused on tactical adaptations rather than matching Allied fuel technology. Luftwaffe fighter units received new directives emphasizing hit-and-run attacks rather than sustained combat. German pilots were instructed to make a single firing pass at bomber formations, then disengage immediately rather than remaining to fight the escorts. These tactics reduced German losses somewhat, but also reduced effectiveness against the bombers. A single firing pass allowed time for only a brief burst of cannon fire. Shooting down a heavy bomber required sustained, accurate fire. The new tactics traded effectiveness for survival, a choice imposed by circumstances rather than preference. Major Walther Dahl, commanding Jagdgeschwader Trista, experimented with massed formation attacks. By concentrating 50 or more fighters into a single Gefechtsverband battle formation, German pilots could saturate the defensive fire from both bombers and escorts, achieving local superiority for brief periods. The tactic showed limited success in June and July 1944, resulting in increased bomber losses during several missions. But it required precise coordination and timing, and it still exposed German fighters to the superior performance of American escorts during the assembly phase. Additionally, assembling large formations consumed time and fuel, resources the Luftwaffe could increasingly ill afford. By August 1944, Luftwaffe day fighter strength on the Western Front had declined to approximately 350 serviceable aircraft, down from over 700 in January. Pilot quality deteriorated as experienced veterans died or were wounded, and inadequately trained replacements filled the gaps. On August 24th, during a mission to Munich, the 8th Air Force encountered perhaps 70 German fighters. The Americans claimed 27 destroyed for the loss of 3 fighters. The exchange ratio had become catastrophic for Germany. The strategic bombing campaign, protected by fighter escorts whose performance had been enhanced by factors including advanced fuel, systematically destroyed German war production. Oil refineries, the source of aviation fuel, became priority targets. The Ploesti oil fields in Romania, Germany's primary natural petroleum source, suffered repeated heavy attacks. Synthetic fuel plants across Germany faced bombardment that disrupted production and forced resources into repairs rather than expansion. By September 1944, German aviation fuel production had dropped to approximately 70,000 tons per month, less than half the amount needed for operational requirements. The Luftwaffe began rationing fuel, grounding entire units and reducing training flights to bare minimums. New pilots sometimes arrived at operational squadrons with as little as 30 hours in their assigned aircraft type. In October, Adolf Galland submitted a detailed assessment to Göring regarding the state of the fighter arm. The report documented declining pilot quality, insufficient fuel, inadequate replacement aircraft, and the overwhelming material superiority of Allied air forces. Galland's conclusion was stark. The Luftwaffe can no longer contest Allied air superiority over Germany. We lack the resources, fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots necessary to reverse the current situation. The air war is lost. Göring, enraged by what he viewed as defeatism, relieved Galland of his position as General der Jagdflieger. But the assessment was accurate. The objective reality of industrial capacity, resource availability, and cumulative attrition had determined the outcome. The final major Luftwaffe offensive came on January 1, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte baseplate involved massing approximately 900 German fighters for surprise attacks on Allied airfields in Belgium, France, and Holland. The operation achieved tactical surprise and destroyed approximately 130 Allied aircraft on the ground. But the cost was prohibitive. Germany lost approximately 240 aircraft and 143 pilots, many of them experienced formation leaders. The Allies replaced their aircraft losses within days. The Luftwaffe never recovered. After Bodenplatte, German day fighter operations over Western Europe became sporadic and ineffective. By March 1945, American fighters ranging over Germany encountered minimal opposition. P-51s, still fueled with 150-grade gasoline when available, flew armed reconnaissance missions that hunted for any remaining German aircraft. They found few. Most Luftwaffe units were grounded by fuel shortages. Those still flying operated at training bases in eastern Germany, preparing pilots for a defense that would never materialize. The production of 150-grade fuel continued until the war's end. Total production from March 1944 through August 1945 reached approximately 180,000 tons. This represented less than 1% of total Allied aviation fuel production during that period, but it equipped the fighter units conducting the most crucial missions at the most critical time. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined the factors that led to Allied air supremacy. The report cited multiple elements: numerical superiority in aircraft and pilots, effective training programs, strategic bombing of German industry, tactical innovations, and technological advantages, including advanced fuels. The survey noted the introduction of 150-grade aviation fuel in March 1944 provided American fighter aircraft with performance capabilities that exceeded German fighters across most operational parameters. This advantage, combined with numerical superiority and superior pilot training, established conditions for air superiority that German forces could not contest effectively. German technical staff, interrogated after the war, confirmed their assessment of the fuel disparity. Oberst Wilhelm Hahnel, the Luftwaffe technical officer who had briefed Göring, stated in testimony to American interrogators, "We understood the chemistry of high-octane fuels. We lacked the industrial infrastructure and petroleum resources to produce such fuels in operationally significant quantities. The Americans could optimize performance because they had sufficient resources to do so. Germany faced choices between producing adequate quantities of standard fuel or small quantities of advanced fuel. We chose quantity over quality because our operational situation demanded it." The fuel represented a small but significant component of Allied air victory. It did not determine the outcome alone, no single factor did. But at a critical moment, when the strategic bombing campaign's success hung in balance, when bomber losses threatened to make daylight operations unsustainable, the extra performance provided by advanced fuel helped tip the scale toward Allied success. The engineering achievement behind 150-grade fuel extended beyond chemistry into industrial mobilization. The United States marshaled petroleum engineers, chemists, refinery workers, quality control inspectors, logistics personnel, and countless others to produce, distribute, and support a fuel that pushed the boundaries of 1940s technology. The fuel required specialized additives manufactured in dedicated chemical plants. It needed custom refining processes that could not be easily implemented. It demanded handling procedures that protected workers from toxic compounds. It necessitated logistics systems that moved perishable product from refineries to combat bases before it degraded. Every aspect presented challenges that required systematic solutions. The solutions demonstrated American industrial capacity operating at peak efficiency. When military requirements demanded fuel beyond the standard octane scale, industry responded. When operational complications emerged, engineering teams developed procedural solutions. When production needed to scale from experimental batches to thousands of tons monthly, refineries retooled and expanded. This capacity to identify requirements, develop solutions, and implement them at scale was not unique to fuel production. It characterized American war mobilization across every industrial sector: aircraft factories, shipyards, ammunition plants, vehicle assembly lines, all demonstrated similar patterns of rapid expansion, quality maintenance, and sustained high-volume output. Germany, despite possessing sophisticated engineering capabilities and technical expertise, could not match this industrial mobilization. Resource constraints, strategic bombing, loss of access to occupied territories, and fundamental limitations of a smaller industrial base created insurmountable disadvantages. The story of 150-grade fuel, told through technical specifications and production statistics, reflected a larger reality. Modern industrial warfare was won not primarily through tactical brilliance or individual courage, though both mattered, but through industrial capacity. The side that could produce more weapons, more ammunition, more fuel, more supplies, faster than they were consumed in combat, held decisive advantage. The fuel itself was remarkable. The silidine additive that made it possible was toxic, corrosive, and unstable. The refining processes required sophisticated chemistry and precise control. The handling demanded careful procedures and protective equipment. Yet thousands of ground crews fueled aircraft with it daily. Hundreds of thousands of gallons flowed through systems designed for less demanding fluids. Pilots pushed throttles forward without hesitation, trusting that the fuel would deliver the power promised by specifications. That trust was justified. The fuel performed exactly as designed. It gave P-51 pilots 30 miles per hour more speed. It provided 400 additional feet per minute climb rate. It extended combat endurance by reducing time spent in enemy airspace. These advantages translated into higher survival rates, more successful missions, and ultimately air superiority. Captain James Holland, the test pilot who flew the first Wright field evaluation, survived the war and flew another 200 combat missions in P-51s. In 1978, interviewed for an oral history project, he reflected on that March morning when he first tested 150-grade fuel. "I knew immediately this was going to change things," Holland said. The performance improvement was dramatic. But more than that, I understood what it represented. The Germans were scraping by with limited resources. We were developing exotic fuels that required massive industrial infrastructure just to produce. That gap, the difference between what we could do and what they could do, that was going to win the war. The fuel was just one example of that gap. The gap Holland described manifested across every dimension of the conflict. In aircraft production, where American factories delivered over 96,000 planes in 1944 compared to Germany's 40,000. In pilot training, where American programs produced fully qualified combat pilots with 400 hours compared to Germany's hastily trained replacements with 150 hours or less. In logistics, where Allied supply chains stretched across oceans and continents with minimal disruption, while German logistics crumbled under Allied bombing and partisan attacks. The air war ended as statistical inevitability rather than dramatic climax. Germany simply ran out of fuel, pilots, and aircraft. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies in 1940, was reduced by May 1945 to isolated pockets of obsolete fighters, flown by undertrained pilots lacking fuel for combat operations. Allied fighters, including thousands of P-51s, roamed German skies unopposed. Many still burned 150-grade fuel, though by war's end the strategic situation no longer required its performance advantages. The fuel had served its purpose during the critical period from March to September 1944, when air superiority hung in balance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.